Well, hello again, and welcome to Forefront 360, where we have conversations at the intersection of excellence in the arts and the Christian faith. I'm your host today, Rich Chrisman, and today I have the pleasure of opening up a unique discussion for you. This episode of Forefront 360 is also an episode of the Understanding the Book of Daniel podcast, hosted by Peter Englert for Browncroft Community Church, where Peter is guiding listeners through a deep study in the biblical book of Daniel. So with me today, I have Peter Englert. Peter, how you doing?
It's good to see you, friend.
I know. It's been so long since we've seen each other. Yeah. Actually, it has been long because you take your Sabbath on a different day than me.
Well,
So
that's going to be changing soon, but
that's true.
we don't need to bore listeners.
We'll
with that.
sync up our schedules soon. And also with me, I have Nate Mancini, a regular voice on Forefront 360.
Hello there. Well, indeed, it's been times, and half a time since all three of us have hung out. So it's good to be here.
That's true. We do have a Forefront 360 episode from, I want to say 2021, maybe, called Reading the Bible as Literature, featuring
Indeed.
Peter Englert. So if you'd like to pause this and go back and listen to that one to get a primer, feel free.
It was fun talking
Precursor.
with Cody.
Yes, Cody hosted that one. Very
Yeah.
cool. That's great. So on Forefront 360, if you're an Understanding Daniel listener, on Forefront 360, we start every episode with what we call a lightning round, particularly an interview. So I'm going to ask a lightning question to both of these guys. So curveball, let's start with Nate Mancini. What is your favorite piece of literature?
Well, as regular listeners are well aware, I am very passionate about The Lord of the Rings. There is another piece of literature I'll mention. I think I mentioned this on the Classics episode. I also really like The Count of Monte Cristo. That's a great book by Alejandro Dumas. And that, I was just looking again. And what's so cool is at the end of that book, there's this amazing line that says, "Until the day when God will deign to reveal the future to man, all human wisdom is contained in these two words, wait and hope."
Wow.
And I just thought that was such a cool ending line that ties into our conversation today.
It sounds like Alexander Dumas may have read the Book of Daniel. It's a fair guess.
I would imagine.
Or at least
Yeah.
heard it read aloud in church.
Yeah.
Super cool. Love that. All right, Peter, what's your favorite piece of literature?
So I think depending on the day, depending on the podcast episode topic, it's hard to narrow it down. But I don't usually talk about poetry, but one of my favorite poems, if not my favorite, is by John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Found. And I thought it kind of like Nate. I thought it went with what we're talking about today. But I'm going to read it.
Yeah.
He talks about when I consider how my light is spent, and this is about his blindness. So I don't know if people know this. He verbally dictated Paradise Lost, which is I think it's like 1,000 pages, all blank verse to his daughters to write.
It's remarkable.
So, but let me read this to you. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless through my soul more bent, to serve therewith my maker and present, my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor light denied? I fondly ask, but patience to prevent that murmur soon replies. God doth not need either man's work or his gifts, who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly, thousands at his bidding speed, and poster o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. And I think there's just a lot. There's a lot of parallels to Daniel.
Yeah.
I also think there's a lot of parallels to the kings of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel kind of lives out this poem, and these kings are trying to make themselves more valuable and more productive, whereas Daniel, I think, is living into the grace of the boundaried and the kind of detoured life.
Yeah. I had not really thought until just now. Like if you were to ask me, which we're going to get to, of course, but if you were to ask me, like, what are the key themes of the Book of Daniel? I don't know if I would have gone to waiting, but thinking about it now, like that is a core theme in the book. Not only in the fact that he's told to wait in his time in Babylon, and also to wait for the future that he is envisioned,
the final
but
end.
but also he waits in the lion's den, and also it's a huge theme in there. It's so interesting.
Yeah. What about you, Rich? What's your favorite piece of literature?
Well, listeners of this podcast know how much I like The Crucible, but let me think. I want to give a different answer than that. Let me think super quickly. Yeah, so I don't know if it's my favorite piece of literature, but I got to give a shout out to a book I read this year that impacted me in a way that very few books have impacted me, and that was The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver.
Okay.
Yeah, so super quickly tells it's in first person, but from the perspective of a few different characters, but it tells the story of a family of young girls that grow up in the Congo during the Belgian Congo, and they're missionaries. And I read the book shortly after returning from a missions trip to Africa, and I was just in the right headspace for it. But she handles just a tremendous amount of the questions that I think are really applicable to Christians in the world today in that novel. And it's also just beautifully written, tremendous imagery, symbolism, so good. I mean, even the title, I don't want to give it away, but the title is something that becomes, that comes up regularly throughout the book and kind of evolves in meaning throughout. So, so good. I haven't read Demon Copperhead yet, but that's her most recent book that got a lot of attention. So Barbara Kingsolver, everybody. Well, thanks. Okay. So today's big question is going to be, how does the book of Daniel, the biblical book of Daniel, stack up when considered through the lens of artistic literature? So is the book of Daniel to be read as literature? And when we read it through that lens, what does that look like? How does the book reveal itself to us? So first of all, to get things established, Peter, I'm going to turn to you to give us a brief narrative summary of the main stories or elements in the book and how it's structured.
So I want to kind of back up because I think that we read the Bible in a 21st century Western mindset. And one of the things that I appreciated about doing the podcast on Understanding Daniel is you're reminded that these biblical stories are written in typology. This morning, I was leading a group and we were talking about the different ways of interpreting the Bible, which is literalistic and allegorical or typology. And the reason why typology is the healthiest is if you read it literal, you can't possibly take everything in the Bible literal. If you read it allegorical, you end up reading into things that aren't there. But if you read it in a typological way, what you're essentially asking is, how does the story of Jesus, which is connected to the Old Testament and the book of Daniel, how does that enter in? And so when I think about the book of Daniel, you think about, chapters 1 through 6 are very narrative, and then chapters 7 through 12 are very apocalyptic. And I think most people think, well, those are two separate sections. But if you take one of those sections out of the book, it doesn't make any sense. So I think the first place I'd want to start structure-wise, and I'll give you a chance to we can dive into the structure, is it's important that we understand the original readers read the book of Daniel as inspirational, dare I even say epic. They are Jewish people that are feeling the oppression, and they're reading this book about how God is intervening in the lives of these Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how God is intervening in their lives in a time when it was the most dark.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. Kyle Navratil, we know you're out there, taught us about typology on this podcast in the past. So
Hermeneutics.
cool. Yeah. Anyway.
The most important word.
Yeah. So as far as, can you give us a little bit about so someone might be tuning in, haven't listened to the prior Daniel episodes, and might not be aware that there are two distinct sections, and even the fact that they're written in different languages, right? Can you give us a quick summary of that?
Yeah. So we'll spend most of our time on the literary first section, then we'll touch on the second section. So The first part of Daniel does a chiastic structure. So for those of you that don't know what a chiastic structure is, we start with an A topic, then there's B, and then there's C, and then we go to a C topic, B, A. So you're making this
cool.
mirroring thing. So
Yeah.
we see in chapter 1, Daniel starts by talking about the destruction of Babylon, the destruction of the temple. Then chapter 2 shares about this dream with Nebuchadnezzar. And this dream with Nebuchadnezzar is this idol image that is connected to chapter 7, which talks about the 4 world empires. So again, the author is coming back to that. And then after chapter 2, we go to chapter 3. It talks about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. It connects to chapter 6, which again, this would be the B section, Daniel in the lion's den. So we see 2 stories of God radically intervening against human power. And then chapter 4 and 5, which would be kind of our C section, it talks about the humiliation of Nebuchadnezzar. So he becomes a donkey.
Such a weird
Story. And then it goes to chapter 5, which is C, which is the overthrow of death of Belshazzar. Now, just for fun, Nathan or Rich, what was in the story of Belshazzar? What did the finger write on the wall?
Oh yeah.
He said this
has
word
become
for word in a
joke at our
meeting.
church, yeah. Yeah, so it's mini tickle upharsin, which means you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting.
So I think what's important is, we would read the literary value into this. Like, is it the exact timeline? But what the writer of Daniel is doing is building this chiastic structure, dare I even say typology, in here. And then the final chapters closes. It's very connected to the book of Revelation. It's end of the world type thing. And again, the major theme, God's in control. God is going to win. And then we also see throughout this, they spend an inordinate amount of time on non-godly leaders. These godly leaders come and go. So Nebuchadnezzar comes and goes, Belshazzar comes and goes, and Darius comes and goes. So I think that chiastic structure is what really helps you see there's some intention to even how they're telling the story.
Yeah. What you're saying right now is making, you said earlier, you were like, dare I say epic, right? Like, look, what makes like a Greek epic or like an ancient epic. It's the fact that there are these, among other things, there are these repeated, almost repeated stories within a stories, and these themes just come back on each other. And that's definitely present here, like you're saying.
And there's a neat, I think, connectedness to the book of Daniel that is like, I think from a language perspective, right? It starts in Hebrew, and then it goes to Aramaic, and then back to Hebrew, right? So there's kind of that interesting connectedness where it's not just a straight half and half, and the language bridges the gap between the genres, right? Between these like narratives and the apocalyptic piece. That's cool. And then also the chiastic structure itself bridges the gap between narrative and apocalyptic. It's just such an interesting connectedness of the book where it's not like, well, we had a book and then we pasted another one on there, but it's actually like a cohesive whole in both of those regards.
Let me give you a quick example that ties everything together because I love what you just said. There's a story in the Old Testament where there's this king that comes into power. I believe it's Rehoboam, but someone's probably gonna correct me. It's like Jeroboam.
Leave a comment.
But
it's tough when their names sound the same.
yeah. But
Some sort of Boam.
But basically, Rehoboam is he has his wise men, and he doesn't listen to the wise men, and then he immediately gets like the kingdom gets split into two
He's
because
like super cruel to all the people and is like, I'm going to be even worse than I was before.
Oh, no.
But then we read the story about the 4 empires, and Nebuchadnezzar does the same thing.
Right.
He looks at his wise men and he says, you got to figure out this dream, but God gives grace through Daniel.
Yeah.
And we see this idea of wisdom and just you can see the contrast. Daniel 12:3 closes with this verse. it says, "Those who are wise will shine like stars in the heavens." What a beautiful picture to close the book of the human wisdom versus the godly wisdom. And just one other like tidbit that I think we're forgetting. Rich and I were doing a podcast on Ron Pierce, who's another scholar.
Yeah.
We forget that the book of Daniel spans like 70 to 80 years.
Yeah.
So Daniel in the lion's den, and even the end of Daniel 7 to 12, he's probably in his 80s.
Wow.
And you think about the loneliness, the trust, the faith.
The exile's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some wisdom there. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's crazy. It's so often, sorry, just real quick. Whenever you look at like pictures of Daniel in like a children's Bible or something like that, he always looks like he's like 35. Like at least in my experience. So I often forget that the book of Daniel spans essentially a whole human life.
Yeah, I mean that's also a Western imposition, right? Where like the hero is the young, dude,
Young,
like
good-looking, bearded guy. Yeah.
But it's just cool. Like you were talking about wisdom, Peter. Like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego exhibit this wisdom in response to like incredibly difficult circumstances, right? Like far beyond what we've experienced. They have this kind of non-anxious presence, right? In a place that's very hostile to them, and they're responding with like courage and in a definitive nature, but also with kind of a patience and a non-anxiousness. Like it's very, very cool.
why did you say non-anxious?
I think because I think we have told ourselves in our culture that the reason we're anxious is because things are bad. Right. And so if somebody says, well, why are you so anxious? Even you could even quote Jesus, but then the response is like, well, have you read the news? Like, obviously you'd be anxious if you were aware of what's going on.
Right.
And what I think what the Bible offers to us is this incredible picture of like, sometimes things are absolutely awful, like just incredibly difficult circumstances of like exile and persecution and death and judgment. And then like, yeah, the response of these gentlemen is like, rather than a response of anxiety, it is this incredible faith, but like this open-handedness, right? Of like whatever God wills. So it's just such a polar opposite from our response of like life bad, therefore me anxious. Like it's truly amazing.
Right. It's so good. So let's just, I'm not saying it's an elephant in the room, but like before we really dive, we already dove into it, but let's jump back to the surface for 1 second. I think that one thing when we talk about the book of Daniel as literature, this book, there are other biblical books that have this quality, but this book, if someone they know nothing about the Bible and you're trying to convince them that reading the Bible can be entertaining, Daniel is a great choice. Like such interesting stories, unforgettable stories. Particularly, the fiery furnace and the Daniel in the Lion's Den stories are
Classic.
in every collection of children's Bible stories because they're so memorable and they're so full of just very easily recallable imagery. Lions, fire, the fourth man in the fire. There's such great imagery there, and that's what causes people to latch onto these stories before even the power of the stories themselves or what God intends in the stories. So I'm thinking, former English teacher, thinking about what, every time I can't read anything without thinking like what assignment I would attach to this. So, in my English class, I would always think about, we would analyze pieces of literature by isolating out the piece's drama, its imagery, its symbolism, and then whether or not the piece can put forth catharsis. So I want to talk about those things quickly. So either Nate, actually, let's start with Nate. What drama do you see in the narrative of Daniel?
Wow. There's so much drama.
Well, pick one. We'll ask Pete too, so don't.
Okay, so read for me your 4 again.
So drama, imagery, symbolism, and catharsis.
Okay, so when I think of drama, I guess I'm just thinking of like those story aspects, the conflict therein, where it's like you have these kind of protagonists in this exilic context. They're being told to do certain things, and we know that they're faithful to God, and they've grown up as like, we're part of the nation of Israel, we're the chosen people, and then they're being told, well, actually, no, you're actually part of the kingdom of Babylon, and you lost, and therefore you need to assimilate. And that's in every way. So you need to do the things we do. You need to learn what we learn, eat what we eat, serve the gods that we serve. And then some of those things they can say, okay, sure. And then other things, it's like, oh, wait, we can't do that without going against our first principles. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a big piece of drama that I see, is like you have this tension of to what extent do we live the way we should live as children of God versus the way that the nation of Babylon, which has won, which is like over us and in authority over us, is telling us to live. What's going to happen when those worldviews clash? And there's like the obvious stuff, right, of the fiery furnace and the lion's den are these incredible moments. But it's pretty interesting, right? Like how you see how they go through with this wisdom of, it's not just this wholesale rejection. It's not just like, I'm not doing your training. Like they go through the training. They go through like Babylonian University.
Right.
They learn all the stuff about the false gods and about, their wisdom process and everything. But then there are certain things where they stand firm.
Yeah.
And like that's where the drama occurs.
Yeah, depending on your translation too, like the different words are used for different things, right? But in some translations, when Daniel is elevated above like the wise men, sometimes the word used there is he is elevated. He is the boss of the magicians and astrologers of Babylon.
Yeah.
So like that is
Put that on your resume.
Exactly. No, but I mean, think about too,
I'm
like
the wisest.
yeah. But think about like in our culture, which is very, I'm thinking evangelical American kind of, Christian culture. We are often, if someone claimed Christ, but then they even associate in any way with someone who might be into whatever, sorcery, whatever of any kind, we'd be like, well, that person's faith is compromised by proximity to that. But Daniel's God puts him in the position of the head of the pagan magicians. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Pete, what's some drama you see in this story?
Let me set up a few pieces. So Daniel is connected to a prophecy in Jeremiah where Jeremiah says, because you haven't listened to me, I'm going to exile you to Babylon. So I think we start there. Then we have this relationship of, we have these individuals, including Daniel, who are trying to serve God in a very pagan place, as you all have pointed out. But then I think the third level is God at any point could have miraculously sent them home.
Right.
Yeah.
But God chooses to leave them there for 70 years. So something that I've been wrestling with, and it's actually a little bit more, you can read more of Daniel about it, is God does all these miraculous things, saves them from the lion's den, allows them to interpret dreams, saves them from the fiery furnace, but doesn't remove them from Babylon.
Yeah.
I think we have to sit with that drama, because the larger drama is, you live in these broken human systems. We live in the broken human system of government and politics and Nebuchadnezzar. And, you can apply that today if you're listening internationally or in the United States. Like we live in these systems, and God doesn't radically save Daniel and his friends, but God still allows them to thrive. There's something very hopeful, but there's also a little something disappointing within that drama too.
Yeah. In my small group last night, we were talking about someone asked in the group, why is it that God blesses in some way, I mean, they're still in exile in Babylon, right? But God blesses Daniel by elevating him, even though he experiences tremendous ups and downs throughout that time. But the person essentially asked, what about everybody else that is not Daniel or the attractive young men who got elevated? You know what I mean?
But Lord, what about him?
What about the unattractive young man? Yeah, but I mean, like, what about them, right? And in our group, we kind of sat with that for a little bit, and we were like, the people of Israel were punished with exile. It would have been unjust and outside of God's character for him to negate that punishment by elevating all of the people of Israel to some comfortable place. The exile is a punishment, and that's something to remember too. Yeah. Cool. I love that. Okay, let's move on to, so we talked about drama. Let's move on to images. So this one's more like, don't think too deeply about it. That's kind of the point. So I'll go with Peter first this time. What images stand out the most from the book of Daniel that have stood the test of time?
I'm just going to simplify it to the concept of kingdoms.
Okay.
Because again, I think you can put a parenthesis around kings and you have Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, Belshazzar, and later Cyrus. All of those kings die. And then we look at the statue and the four kingdoms, both in chapter 7 and chapter 2, they all pass away. We're still talking about God. It was hilarious. This is how you know you're successful as a pastor. Apparently my daughter went into school and they were talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and her teacher was like, how do you say that? And, of course, my sweet daughter raises her hand.
Perfect.
And she goes, Nebuchadnezzar, So we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar and even outside the Bible, but Christianity and God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit have made far more a radical kingdom. And even the last part in the symbolism, the rock that crushes, Peter, when Jesus talks to Peter, he talks about building on the rock, which is the church. Yeah. And, he talks about Jesus being the chief cornerstone.
The stone that the builders
rejected.
Yeah, it's so good.
And you think about that, and not to get too excited, but you think about how powerful that is, that when Jesus comes in, if you're reading Daniel as a Jew in Jesus's time, you thinking he's going to overthrow the world, but Jesus is saying, blessed are those who mourn because they'll be comforted.
Yeah.
Blessed are they. Like when the Good Samaritan, he says, do as the Samaritan did. It's a totally different kingdom. And I think that image is so powerful.
Yeah, it's so cool. That's so good.
The stone.
Yeah, so good. All right, what other images just stand out to you? Anybody?
I mean, Ancient of Days, Son of Man. These are these are huge.
You guys are going heavy. I was thinking like golden statue, lion, angel.
Yeah. It is funny too how you have like the golden statue and then you have like the statue in the dream.
Yeah.
Interesting connections there.
No, that is fascinating. We were talking in our sermon last week at Browncroft. We were talking about whether or not a lot of people jump to the fact that the statue. We have the statue in the dream, and then in the next chapter, Nebuchadnezzar builds a great golden statue, and it's like those are not the same thing. We don't, but that's funny.
It is ironic for sure.
For sure, yeah.
Interesting choice, Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, for sure. So I feel like we touched on like the idea of the rock and stuff. Obviously, is a symbol as well. The rock representing Jesus, the statue of multiple types of. Well, actually, both statues are symbols in different ways.
Yeah.
But other than those two, are there any other pieces of symbolism that stand out strongly to you?
Maybe. So I'm more, the Bible nerd. I'm not the English, art nerd that you two.
That's why you're here.
But, maybe this isn't a symbol, but you can't read the book of Daniel without seeing prayer.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so powerful. There's some theologians, and I tend to be kind of in this realm, in this camp, that Jesus is the better Daniel. So Jesus doesn't get saved from the lion's den. He actually dies on the cross. And what we see before that is Daniel prays 3 times a day. We see these verses about Jesus going to prayer. We talk about the life of faith as in the Bible being descriptive, not prescriptive. So I think sometimes you can read Daniel with this idea of literalism and saying, oh, I'm going to go pray 3 times a day.
I'm going to only eat vegetables.
Yeah, I only eat vegetables. I'm not going to stop you from doing that. But I think the symbol is, what does a life of prayer look like?
Yeah.
And we see that in Daniel, and then that points to Jesus. Jesus lives that out in such a powerful way.
Yeah.
And in many ways, the last part that we haven't talked a ton about, but as you read it, if you read it more as a prayer of what God is doing, that God wins ultimately, that's a form of prayer, worship, and trust.
Yeah. That's so true.
Wow, that's so good. Like, it is amazing how frequently we'll like run in the opposite direction, right? Where with something like prayer, I think of so many things in the Christian life where we learn like, oh, that was descriptive of something, or oh, that was like an Old Testament practice or whatever. And now we're in the new covenant, like I'm free, doesn't apply anymore. And then we like run in the opposite direction and forget the whole purpose of the initial thing. Like with like tithing or whatever, like, oh, I don't have to tithe. It's not required anymore. No big deal. Therefore, I'll be selfish, right? Like that doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
Like I should be even more generous in the era of Christ than I would have been under the law. And like similar with prayer, where it's like, well, maybe like you don't have a specific prayer practice that's been mandated to you, but also like, shouldn't you be praying more? Shouldn't you be praying like in deeper communion with the God who is with you in Christ? Like there's like this beautiful expansion. And when we're so quick to say like, that's just an old thing.
Yeah,
Well,
that's so true.
So in Daniel 2, what I love is, and I think we somewhat miss this, is Nebuchadnezzar gives out the gauntlet. Tell me what my dream is and interpret it, or everybody dies.
Yeah.
And Daniel goes to his friends and he says, plead to God for mercy.
Yeah.
Like, just think how powerful that is. And that's even why I was asking about the non-anxious question, because I believe that when they went in the presence of the king, they were non-anxious, but that doesn't mean that anxiety wasn't there.
Yeah.
And that's not what you're saying.
There's still fear for sure.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
and I was having a discussion with my small group. Like, when was the last time we said for a strategy, just pray?
Yeah, that's so true.
So, and I'm thinking about like a test for my daughter. It's not like I tell her, hey, pray and don't study. And that's a whole misunderstanding.
Daniel studied.
Daniel did study, but
He studied a lot of stuff.
but you think about when you get into the moment that prayer is the only thing you have.
Yeah.
Why don't we live with a degree of that in our lives?
Yeah,
For sure.
that's so good.
Yeah, because we serve this incredible God that like can do and does the impossible. I love that with the other magicians where they're like no man can do what you've asked us to do. Only the gods could do this.
Yeah.
Well, and Daniel says that.
Yeah.
Daniel
and he's
like
yeah,
when
that's true.
When you read it in scripture, Daniel says,
Yeah.
no person, like, that is like the worst setup line. Like,
Yeah.
I can just imagine Nebuchadnezzar getting angry.
Oh yeah.
You've got it correct. But God does speak to man.
Yeah. This dude needed some L-theanine, like de-stress tea. Like this Nebuchadnezzar is like just killing everybody all the time. But I was reading a couple of verses like across translations just to see what it looked like, and it really stuck out to me. I was laughing in the Message translation that when the magicians are telling Nebuchadnezzar they can't interpret their dream, they're like, "No man could do what you said. The only person who could answer that is someone who's close with the gods, and they don't hang around the likes of us." And I remember being like, "What?" Yeah, but sometimes the message hits. But
How about Emmanuel?
yeah, that's good. Okay, so the fourth metric I was looking at is this idea of catharsis. Catharsis is a Greek term that was coined by Aristotle, and it refers to that powerful effect that occurs to a person when they experience a great drama. So Aristotle was writing about this specifically in the context of Greek plays, like when you watch a drama on stage. But students of literature have expanded it to really any narrative artistic experience. Even paintings have been described as cathartic. So what that powerful experience is when you essentially live out what the characters are experiencing in the drama. You live out the drama internally in your mind and in your heart and in your soul. And then the same emotions that are being experienced by the characters are experienced internally by you, which ultimately leads to a release of pent-up emotion. So the idea, and there's actually recently, historically speaking, there has been a little bit of pushback by psychology on the idea that catharsis is real. But at least classically, the concept was, if I watch a play about something tragic, I'm making this up. I watch a play about somebody whose spouse is unfaithful to them, and then the person in their anger murders their unfaithful spouse, and then they feel tremendous regret. And that's the tragedy. In Aristotle's view, when you watch that drama, you experience what that character went through in a small way internally, which then allows you to learn from that without experiencing it yourself.
So let me ask you.
Yeah, go for it.
When, and it could be Daniel, when was the last time you experienced catharsis?
Oh boy.
Reading Aristotle.
Reading Aristotle, of course. Seeing Greek dramas. No. The reason why I made that exasperated sound is because I have to be honest with what came to my mind. So this year, what was it? I want to say May 2025. They re-released Star Wars: Revenge of the Sith, and
That was the time.
that was it. No, I, you can knock Star Wars all you want. Sorry, my mic is like falling. Give me 1 second. All right. You can knock Star Wars all day, but I experienced significant catharsis. If you've seen episode 3, sorry if you haven't, spoilers. When all the Jedi are being killed, they're being betrayed by their clones. Not their clones, the clone army. And a lot of this is nostalgia because I saw this when I was in 8th grade for the first time, and I was very malleable at that time. But the experience, I could feel the first time I saw the movie, and when I saw it in theaters again this time, this weight in my very soul from that scene, and then also watching Obi-Wan Kenobi fall apart emotionally when the person that he's loved the most in his life, in Anakin Skywalker, has been destroyed, and he now has to destroy him in response. And I feel that I have, in a very small way, every time I watch Revenge of the Sith, I feel like I go through that loss in a small way, and I feel like I've grown from that. So
I'm glad we got to Star Wars eventually.
you can't have a Forefront episode without it. Yeah.
Thanks for teeing that up, Peter.
Yeah.
Well, Rich has put up with us kind of having a side conversation. He's
Oh,
been
no,
good
that's
host,
fine, that's fine.
that's
So before, I want to ask you guys the same question, actually. But before that, when you experience the book of Daniel, and the answer can be no, when experiencing the stories in the book of Daniel, do you feel there is a cathartic element to the book of Daniel? And if so, where?
I wouldn't say there's a specific moment, but you and I did an interview of Ron Pierce.
Yeah.
And he shared, as a biblical scholar, he talks about Daniel having a dark night of the soul. And that has repainted all of kind of the way that I read it. I don't think I've experienced, and this is very American, we like to compare, like I haven't experienced the loneliness of Daniel.
Yeah.
I'm not this, but I do think that we overplay that, where it does feel like, we experience situations where you're in some type of lion's den, you're needing to stand up, you're needing to deliver bad news, and it just feels very, like I said, the dark night of the soul. I think what happens to Daniel is, and I think I've said this quote a couple times about St. John of the Cross.
Yeah.
I wish I had it with me, but greed becomes contentment, pride becomes humility. And what you see in Daniel is you see this growth towards those different values. And so I think that that's the cathartic part, is that we live in this world as exile because of sin and brokenness, and to realize like this is not our home.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good.
I think when I think about catharsis, the theme that comes to mind is like death and resurrection. And maybe for me, like, the catharsis comes more in the resurrection part than the dying part. But I think both are integral to the reality. And I just think it's interesting that like God baked this into the fabric of reality, that like, he creates these people who sin and death comes into the world, and ultimately he himself dies, and then he rises again, like the first fruits of the resurrection, and then starts setting things right. And then in the end of time, like the whole world is resurrected.
Yeah.
And so there's this incredible like death and resurrection motif throughout all of life, all of the whole world and all of history. And that comes in the book of Daniel, right? Like we're talking about these stories of these men who go into what is essentially a death. There's like this moment of death, like the fiery furnace and like the lion's den, and then come out the other side. So while their death is not a literal death because God saves them from it, they're still like going into it. There's a symbolic death that takes place.
It's that
is
poetic
like
imagery that's used throughout the Bible when like
type.
the psalmist says like, I'm not going to quote this directly, but like, Lord, protect me so that I do not go down into the pit.
Yeah.
But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel do go down to the proverbial pit, and God brings them out.
And so there are stories of like going down into the pit and good people just die, right?
Yeah.
But then there's this looking forward to the resurrection at the end. And then there are stories like this one that's like combining the whole story into one and shrinking it down and saying, yes, there's this death and resurrection motif in this small area of this story. So that's, I think, what's inspiring to me. And like, that comes out in so many stories. And probably the stories that most impact me are ones where that takes place. Like I think about, something like the Shawshank Redemption, right? It's effectively a death and resurrection, or like even things like, you just think random like modern movies like Captain Phillips or Gravity, or Toy Story 3 is an awesome one, right? Reckons with mortality and stuff. There's effectively this sort of death and resurrection that takes place. And those are always like super moving to me.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's so good.
So should we share our examples of catharsis?
Yeah, please do. Yeah. So if I descended into the pit and referenced Star Wars, what do you guys got? No shame. What's something that you've feel like you've lived through the drama of?
My favorite movie of all time, and not many people share this. If you have this as your favorite movie, I'd love to meet you. It's 500 Days of Summer with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and
it's a good movie.
It's a really good movie. I saw it at a time. It came out after I graduated college, and I was single. And
it's a horrible time to see that.
But that's the healing power of catharsis. Obviously the story is not identical, and I say that very clearly. It's similar, but I think we've all been there in that situation, that those who watch that movie and find it cathartic is you're looking for love. You invest all this time into a person to find out at the end of it, it's over, and it's funny. And this is like the unredeemed, maybe depraved part of me. Like every time I see Zooey Deschanel, who plays Summer, like I literally like cringe because like she fits the type of, a girl that I might have gone out, or a woman that I've gone out on a date with, that was just being themselves, but like was kind of into it, but really wasn't. And
I feel like that's a common millennial male experience. I don't know. I feel like I could apply that to myself, but luckily I saw 500 Days of Summer when I was happily married for the first time, so that helped me not experience the catharsis. No, I'm just joking.
Well,
Yeah.
one quick thing about 500 Days of Summer. One of my favorite scenes is they talk about ideal and reality, and there's
Yeah.
2 screens, and it's going through his ideal, and the reality is like he's like all by himself. And I can think of multiple moments that's happened to me.
It's good. Anything particularly cathartic to you, Nate?
Well, I talked about movies, but no, I mean in terms of
If you guys don't know Nate, if you're a listener, he's a filmmaker and film buff.
a
So
movie guy. No, I mean again, there are different elements to catharsis, but I think. I mean, like one thing for us is like we didn't know if we were going to have kids for a while, and then eventually did. So that was like, and we also had like miscarriages and right. So there's like all this, there's this grief and this waiting, and there's like the hardship, and then, what better example is there of like new life and new birth and like literally having kids, right? And so like God did provide that, and I know he doesn't always do that, but that's just like in my life that's a thing that happened where it was like kind of grieving the loss of a future that might have been, and then like that future actually breaking into reality, and now it's that like daily life with those kids. That's very emotional thing.
Was there a specific piece of art or literature that you found cathartic in that season?
Oh man, I don't know, like beyond. I'll just keep telling you Lord of the Rings, but
you can say it. You can say it. Yeah, that's huge. I actually was going to bring up Lord of the Rings earlier, and I decided not to. So there you go. That's so true. So the whole purpose of, or not the purpose, but the value of catharsis, according to Aristotle. So not a biblical reference, right?
I mean, who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Yeah, I don't know, Plato.
Plato, but
Anyway,
I'm stuck on. I want to meet these psychologists that don't believe in catharsis.
yeah. I mean, if you, just for the record, if you Google it, like, is catharsis real or something, you will find articles that claim that the classical belief that you can internally grow from a simply, like visual or auditory input is like questionable to some. But,
stories can't really impact us, Peter.
yeah.
I didn't say I
Not in
disagreed.
a tangible way.
I was
Yeah,
not
yeah.
aware. I'm curious.
Yeah, I believe it wholeheartedly. But the purpose though of this, or the effect of it, is that you actually grow from that artistic experience. And if you are a listener coming from the Understanding Daniel end, you haven't experienced Forefront 360 yet. One of the, basically the reason why we do Forefront, which is, conversations and meetups at the intersection of artistic excellence and authentic Christian faith. The reason why we do that is because we believe in the power of the arts to grow us spiritually and mentally. So we can be spiritually formed to the likeness of Christ through Christ honoring art. So that's
through both the creation and experience of those things. Yeah.
Right. So what do you guys think? And this will be kind of our other than a quick light question I got, back in the queue for you. This is our last kind of heavy question here. What would you say that God intends us to experience when we're reading Daniel? What growth does he intend for us when we go through that book? And we've touched on a lot of this already, but maybe just summatively, like if each of you could pick like one thing, what growth does God intend for us when we read or listen to the book of Daniel?
Hope.
Expand on that a little bit. No, I'm with you.
Wait and hope.
Give us a little more.
I was trying to do an artistic pause, but
That was good.
No, what we see horizontally on Earth in front of us is not necessarily the vertical reality of God's control. I think our hope is not based on kings and kingdoms and political figures and our 401k and our circumstances going right.
Yeah.
Our hope, we need to be tied to a greater story. And that's what the gospel does. So I think Daniel reminds us we are tied to a bigger story from the creator of the universe, the savior that died and rose again. And that's why we can wake up in Babylon one more day and experience his grace, experience his mercy, experience his courage. That's hope.
Can we make t-shirts that say "Wake up in Babylon one more day"? That's so cool. I love that.
One more day in Babylon.
Yeah. Another day in Babylon. All right. What do you got, Nate?
So one commentator that I listened to says that like the theme of Daniel is, despite present circumstances, God is in control and he will have the final victory. Pretty good summation of the book of Daniel. Maybe that's kind of the theme of the Bible too.
Yeah.
But that's why Daniel is such a great book of the Bible. But I think that is a bit of the key to unlock what I have always found to be a difficult question about prophecy in Scripture, which is you'll listen to a lot of, wise people and pastors who will say, don't worry about the specifics. Don't worry about the specific numbers and all this. Don't worry about that. Just focus on kind of the main point. And the question in my mind has always been, well, if I'm not supposed to worry about the specifics, why so many specifics? Why like so much specificity of prophecy if there's just kind of one basic point? Why spend all of this parchment on all of this detailed vision if I'm not supposed to have any idea what it means? And I think maybe that's a much bigger conversation. But one little key that I think has been helpful to me is realizing that like sometimes the specificity is not to say, this is a precise thing that you are going to know exactly what it means, but rather this is a very precise thing and God knows exactly what it means. And you need to know that God knows exactly what it means. So for example, when it comes to things like we talked about time, times, and half a time, and the 77s and all these things. And some of them can have, general interpretations where, oh, that means a long time or something. But there's a specificity where God is saying, I've numbered everything. Like, I know everything. I am sovereign over everything.
Yeah.
And the level of detail that we see in Daniel, even in the prophetic section, which we haven't talked about as much, this kind of apocalyptic literature, it does lend to this idea of like, we are small, but God is big, that we are not in control. The bad guys are in control, but also like you personally, Christian, are not in control, but God is in control and he'll have the final victory. And I think that's a really interesting dimension of understanding God's control that like the book of Daniel gives us, is God showing us, yeah, I know the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for that. Let's wrap up our conversation with something a little more lighthearted, but just on the same topic. We recommend you read the Bible as literature, the book of Daniel.
If you haven't yet read the book.
Yeah. But other than Daniel, what's another book of the Bible that stands out to you? If someone were like, oh, I read Daniel, fantastic experience, where do I go next? What's another book of the Bible that you would recommend to someone looking to read the Bible through a literary lens?
I'm going to change my answer just for a second. So
Okay.
First of all, let me caveat, whenever a person that's newer to the Bible says, hey, what book should I read? I always tell them John.
Yeah.
The imagery there and all of the Bible, the Old Testament points to Jesus. The New Testament points back to Jesus. So there's 4 Gospels. Those are 4 biographies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But if I was to encourage someone to read the Bible as literature, I would want them to read Ecclesiastes. And
That's a good answer.
I just think that to be able to feel the questions of Koheleth, the teacher from 1,000 years ago, to be able, thousands and thousands, asking the same questions that we're asking, And then I'm going to give this one for free,
Yeah.
but this is an extra biblical literature. But
Okay.
to come back to where we started, you know, I don't usually recommend Genesis because there's a lot of questions with it. I still think it's good. It's the first book of the Bible. I would encourage everybody to read Paradise Lost and just to hear how John Milton just connects the Bible with literature, you know, in the blank verse form, in the imagery, just to see his perspective on it. I think you might come away feeling something different.
Yeah.
From John to John Milton.
Yeah. Between two Johns.
I was actually going to say the Book of Esther,
Okay.
which is it's kind of like the sequel, right? It's one of the sequels to Daniel in chronology, but you know,
Isn't Xerxes like right after Cyrus, or I might be
that
wrong
could
about
be.
that.
I mean, it's certainly the Persian Empire.
Sure, yeah.
So kings experts weigh in, but yeah, I think Esther is such a remarkable book of literature, and it has those interesting things of like God is not present in the book but also very present, and the way the narrative plays out is like the way that you would write it if you were writing like an incredible dramatic story with all the ups and downs and heroes and villains and that sort of thing. So I guess when I think of Bible as literature, I'm like, yeah, you can't get much better than Esther.
That's awesome. Just to clear up my mistake there, I just looked it up. Esther is like 150 years after Daniel. So,
Okay.
but
There were
yeah.
some other
but
leaders
just
in
good
between.
to know. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yes, still a sequential sequel. I think Daniel, Ezra, Esther probably. And,
Yeah. Probably. So my answer is the book of Job. And I think the book of Job is actually very similar to Daniel in a lot of ways, in the way that it begins, like how Daniel begins in a more narrative sense, and then it becomes a very much abstracted, symbolic, apocalyptic literature. Job has sections that are very much narrative and read very much in the style of any classical mythology. And then there are also elements that are far more poetic and philosophical. But the narrative of Job, if we're reading it as literature, Job stacks up super well with other quote unquote mythological texts of that time. You know, with Satan appearing before the divine council of God and making kind of like a deal with God that expands, and the deal keeps getting worse all the time. And then and then God interacting with Job and calling him out in this conversation, also culminating with a pretty obvious, pretty direct prefigurement of Jesus, in that as well. And then Job's death and resurrection, Job being brought down to such a lowly state and then being restored to more than he ever was before by the power of the Redeemer, who would lay a hand on both heaven and earth. Just so cool. So I would recommend Job.
We can edit this out because there's a long enough pause, but I want to ask you two something, because I think this has to relate to the Bible.
Yeah.
Do you care that Tolkien wrote his own language for Lord of the Rings?
Let's not edit this out. Go ahead.
Do I care?
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, like,
Sure, I care. It's awesome.
well, so why do you care though?
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean by care?
Like,
do you mean like, does it matter?
Yeah, does it matter? Like, why do it?
Oh, well, I think it's deep. I think it's deeply impressive, right? It shows a deep commitment to the craft. I mean, people like different fantasy literature, but I think most people agree, who have read a lot of fantasy literature, that like the Lord of the Rings is an incredibly like dense volume that has a historical kind of credibility to it, and it's in the way that it's read. It's like, it really does feel like you're reading scriptural texts when you're reading the Silmarillion, and obviously pieces of that come into the Lord of the Rings. So I think in that regard, I think Tolkien was such a linguist, and the fact that he invented languages gave him the foundation to write a story that felt like a history. And that's what he said he wanted to do, right? He said he wanted to write a history for England that it didn't have. And so he made one up.
I'll do you one better, which I know
So
that
it's
Nate.
pretty cool.
It's super cool. I'll do you one better, which is I know what Nate would say because I learned this from him. But the concept of, I mean, Tolkien was a big believer in the that partaking in the creative act is an act of worship in our being a child of God that's kind of mimicking the Father, and he even writes that in the Silmarillion. He kind of puts himself in there in the narrative about Aule creating the dwarves, but the idea that the Tolkien's creation of a world as if his word, like God can speak into existence a world, and his word has the power to make that real. We don't have that power at this time, but we mimic our Father in our Imago Dei ability to imagine and design. And that's a tremendous act of worship in the way that when my 2-year-old son copies me exactly, I'm not saying that he's worshiping me, right? But that is a very flattering, loving act, So I think if someone were to say, like, does it matter or why should I care that Tolkien spent the time to make a language? I would say that Tolkien understood that going to that length of mimicking God in the creation of a whole world and essentially writing the Bible of Middle Earth is an act of worship.
So I bring that up because I go back to some of the stuff that we said about the parts of the Bible that we don't understand, and because we don't understand the details, and dare I even say that the locusts are not Apache helicopters. If you've ever heard that from Revelation.
Tim LaHaye is going to call in.
Yeah, I'm probably going to get some call, but
Double fulfillment.
It's a both hand.
I wonder, like, I asked that question because you use these words of beauty and awe. And like, if there's some parts of the Bible that we're called to look at as literature, but we're so Western in our thinking. And let me give you a bad example because you were bringing up Job. Elihu, the youngest of Job's friends, talks for 3 chapters. He really doesn't say anything.
Yeah.
Like
it's a tough to get through section.
It's a very tough to get, but you begin to ask yourself, how did this become the inspired word of God? And
wait, how did this happen?
How did
Which
this-
one of this?
but you think about it within the span of Job, like how much more powerful is it when you read what God says?
Yeah.
How much more powerful is it? Because you're literally hearing every human argument. And I think that when we try to apply the Bible like within a verse without looking at the deeper context, I mean, that's why it's worth it to write another language as Tolkien did.
Yeah.
Is that sometimes we get so lost in the forest and the trees as opposed to looking at, that's what moves you about the Bible. It's not that you know all the answers, but you know the God of the Bible who has all the answers.
So cool. Don't edit that out. All right. Well, we are over time, so I'm going to close us. Thank you so much for being here. Listeners, we encourage you to check out the rest of the Understanding the Book of Daniel podcast, as well as the ongoing Forefront 360 conversations about how art and creativity intersects with the Christian faith. If you'd like to continue this conversation, please reach out at Forefront Fest on social media, or you can email us at info@forefrontfestival.com. If you are in or near Rochester, New York, be on the lookout for updates for our artist circle that meets on the third Thursday evening of each month. We'd love to see new faces there. Friends of the show, keep engaging with excellent art and authentic faith. And studiers of the Book of Daniel, enjoy the goodness, truth, and beauty of what God has given us in the Bible. Until next time.